What we're looking at here is the world's longest sniper rifle, in action in Ukraine. We think these guys are from the Ghosts of Bakhmut sniper unit. The rifle they're carrying is the SnipeX Alligator, and it is huge. But snipers are supposed to be stealthy, so what's the point of a rifle so big it takes 2 men to carry it? We're going to examine this clip, delve into the history of rifles like this, and speak to an expert to find out. At 6 foot 6 inches without a silencer, it is bound to be taller than the person shooting it. It weighs almost 30 kilos, that's 66 pounds, and it fires a 14.5 by 114 millimeter .57 caliber round that was originally used in Soviet heavy machine guns. It's fed by a box magazine, and it has a bolt action, which makes it more accurate. To stop the recoil taking the sniper's head off, it has a muzzle brake on the end of the barrel, a front bipod, a rear monopod, a padded shoulder rest, and a padded cheek rest. Down here is a carrying handle to make it easier to transport, and the barrel can be detached so it can fit inside vehicles. In this video, a sniper and his spotter are taking part in a covert mission thought to be somewhere near Bakhmut in September last year. As the footage starts, you see the sniper pushing the bolt into place, loading a bullet into the chamber. He takes his time to pick his target, using dials to adjust his scope. At this distance, he will need to carefully take account for things like wind, which may push the bullet to the left or the right of his target, and he'll also need to take into account gravity, which will drag the bullet downwards and cause it to fly in an arc rather than a straight line. And perhaps even the Coriolis effect, the rotation of the Earth which, in the northern hemisphere, would push the bullet slightly to the right over extreme distances. Though, in truth, this effect is very subtle. Once he's happy, the sniper opens fire. But he doesn't seem all that pleased with his first attempt. So he reloads, finds his target a second time, and after a few tense moments, he fires a second shot. He waits a few seconds while the bullet is in the air and then says, the target is down. Now he and his comrade pack up the rifle and make their getaway. A second piece of footage shows them carrying the rifle back to a truck, which is waiting nearby. They load the rifle into the back before both of them jump in to keep it secure, and then they take off. This is how the Ghosts of Bakhmut sniper unit operated for months in 2023, after the city fell to Yevgeny Prigozhin's Wagner mercenaries. Led by a sniper whose codename is Ghost, their mission was to make the occupation of the city unbearable for the Russians. Ghost explained that they would ride vehicles into battle before jumping off and walking to a sniping spot they had picked out for themselves. Generally, that was a field somewhere overlooking Bakhmut. Once there, they would set up their rifles and wait for up to 16 hours for any Russians unlucky enough to wander into their crosshairs. As of October 2023, the unit's body count was 500 Russian soldiers. Not a single one of their snipers was killed in return. And that was the last time we heard from Ghost. At this point you might be thinking, well, that's all very impressive, but what's the point of a sniper rifle that's so big 2 men have to carry it? After all, snipers are supposed to be stealthy, and good luck sneaking up on anyone whilst lugging that thing around. And you would be right, except in this case it doesn't matter, because this rifle's main targets aren't people. The Alligator is known as an anti-materiel rifle, and that's because it's supposed to shoot things like armored vehicles, truck transports, radar arrays, parked jets, even helicopters. From a mile away, the Alligator is powerful enough to put a bullet straight through the armor of a Russian BTR troop transport, and you don't need to be particularly stealthy when you're taking out loud, large vehicles. Not that the rifle can't kill people, in fact, it's very good at it. Because it's firing such a large bullet with such a lot of force behind it, the Alligator's effective range is 1.25 miles, but Ukraine has used it to kill Russian soldiers well beyond that. In November 2022, one sniper claimed to have hit a target at 1.68 miles. That was the second longest sniper kill in history, at least until a different Ukrainian sniper used a similar rifle, called Horizon's Lord, to take out a man 2.3 miles away. And again, you don't have to be all that stealthy if the men you're shooting at are too far away to see or hear you. Anti-materiel rifles date back to the First World War, when they were created shortly after the Allies invented the tank, which makes sense when you think about it, since that's the thing they were supposed to kill. The T. Guerre rifle was based on the much smaller Mauser and fired a 13mm bullet that was enough to go through the relatively thin armour of tanks like the British Mark I. Similar rifles were also used in the Second World War by the Soviets, like the PTRS-41. But these were designed to be used over relatively short distances, and by the end of the Second World War, tank armor was way too thick for them to penetrate in any case. So the concept largely fell out of fashion, at least until an American photographer named Ronnie Barrett came up with the idea of creating a large caliber sniper rifle in the 1980s. The story goes that Barrett was photographing US troops operating .50 caliber machine guns when the idea came to him. He initially struggled to get the weapon made because it seemed like there wasn't a market for it, but he eventually found a machinist who was willing to produce his designs. In 1982, the first Barrett .50 cal sniper rifle was produced, and it very quickly sold out. At first, mostly to sport shooters.
But the CIA soon placed an order to equip the Afghan Mujahideen, elements of which would later become the Taliban, who were fighting the Soviets at the time.
The first national armed forces to adopt it were the Swedes, before the US Marines decided to buy some. Now, the rifle is used by more than 50 countries, and even those which don't use it have created versions of their own. While these rifles have produced some truly incredible distance kills against soldiers, their main purpose is still to take out vehicles. They can't kill tanks anymore because the armor is just too thick. That job has instead been taken over by anti-tank rockets. But rockets are expensive and difficult to produce, and they're not worth wasting on other, less well-armored vehicles like trucks and troop transports. And that's where the rifle comes in. Using nothing more than a few cheap bullets and the skill of the sniper, they can take out vehicles potentially worth millions of dollars. That's useful no matter which army you're in. But for Ukraine, which has been short of missiles since Russia invaded and is still struggling, that is a huge advantage, particularly when you're fighting a country like Russia, which has more vehicles in its army than any other nation on Earth.
But do huge sniper rifles really make a difference in today's warfare? We asked Tony Neophytou, the South African gunsmith who designed an anti-materiel rifle, for his reaction.
Obviously, he's just chambered a cartridge. He's adjusting the scope. And he's going to expect a huge muzzle blast. That's what I'm very sure of. He's probably dialing the scope in for the distance, which is very important. You've got to have a rangefinder or some means of knowing at least where you are in range to quite a good level of accuracy to be able to hit the target. And that can jump around quite dramatically in combat situation from 300 to 1,300 meters in an instant. So being able to change the scope very quickly and accurately is important. There's fight shop. A silencer of some sort, especially on a weapon of this type, is extremely important to minimize the signature of the weapon and its position. Since the muzzle blast is so huge and easily visible, it is a big disadvantage. So having a muzzle device of some sort to minimize that will be very advantageous. What I find strange about this particular one, from what I understand, is the barrel is not quickly and easily detachable. And I think the weapon weighs in the region of about 25 kilograms, which makes it seriously unwieldable. For example, on the NTW, the barrel was very quickly detachable, and at least it could be broken down into two parts that one individual could carry each, whereas in this case, exfiltrating or moving out of where you are becomes quite an issue. But the same would apply to a mortar crew. So it depends on the tactical situation and how these things are being used.
The first thing I asked him was what makes an anti-materiel rifle different from a regular rifle.
They were not designed to shoot individual people. They were designed to shoot what they call materiel targets. Any vehicles, radar installations, aircraft, helicopters, any kind of material would be a suitable target for something like this. So they're not expressly designed for pinpoint accuracy in trying to hit an individual at long range. That is why they use the larger calibers that they do, so they can inflict damage and have some kind of armor penetration to some degree. They never will be an anti-tank weapon at all. Even during the First World War, and especially during the Second World War, weapons like this Tire, the solid turn 20mm, the Boy's anti-tank rifle became obsolete very quickly and early on in the war. The armored vehicles became much too thick to penetrate, but they still retained a usefulness. So they were very often used in much larger numbers than one thinks. If you look at the Eastern Front, the Russians used the PTRS and the PTRD 14.5 very widely and continued to use it throughout the war because there were many vehicles, trucks, and lighter vehicles that were very vulnerable to this kind of weapon. As the war grinds on anywhere, those sophisticated anti-tank missiles and such like will be kept for the purpose for which they were designed and not wasted on lesser targets. And that is where a weapon like this could be quite useful.
Next, I wanted to know what kind of targets exactly an AMR would be shooting at.
The juiciest targets would be these rocket launchers, logistics vehicles, and radar installations that are mobile.
How about helicopters or jets?
It would be a rare occasion to hit a helicopter in the air, and unless you were by luck in absolutely the right place and the right time. But as an anti-air weapon, I don't think it would be very viable at all. It's such an unwieldy thing that there's no way you could bring it to bear in a quick fashion very quickly at all.
But if they were on the ground?
Absolutely lethal, for sure. Absolutely.
And even though they're not designed for it, AMRs can take out troops at very long distances. I wanted to know from Tony what made them so lethal at long range.
Well, I think they're powerful enough in terms of the energy that they have. For example, the 14.5 caliber has the same energy at 1,000 meters that the common Browning 50 has at the muzzle. So that gives you an indication of the kind of power that they have. The accuracy of these things is nowhere near what an anti-personnel rifle is. The accuracy is much lower. So I think these long-range hits with this type of weapon, I think luck has a lot more to do with it than one thinks, truly. You know, hitting a small target at 1,700, 2,200 meters is extremely difficult. Getting your range sorted out, and the further the range becomes, the higher the angle of the drop of the bullet, it becomes very difficult. It's not a repeatable thing in the sense that you can lie down and consistently hit something in that sort of range. So I think with experience and depending on the scenario, if the guys manage to fire a couple of shots and see where they fall and where they land, he can maybe walk them up onto the target. It's not a very precise science. It takes a lot of experience and dedication. So certainly you can hit at long range, but hitting a small target like a human-sized target would be very, very difficult. I think luck has a lot more to do with it. I think the NTW was reported as having struck someone at, I think, 2,400 meters in the DRC. That was the longest kill with a 14.5. But I think that as well was a bit of luck.
So, what is it like to actually use a rifle like this? And how easy is it to hit a target at long range?
I think the big trick is the scope. Are you correctly zeroed in to start? Unless you correctly dialed in to start with and very accurately dialed in, it's very difficult to extend that to a further range because the areas just become bigger and bigger. You've got to adjust the scope so that it correlates to the point of impact of the bullet. And usually the scope will allow you to do that at a start distance of 100 meters, for example. So at least you can dial in quite quickly and accurately and know where you are. So when you suddenly move up to 1,000 meters, you will know what the ballistic performance of that cartridge, whatever cartridge it is you're using, and you can dial it up on the scope. Then 16 clicks up will be 1,000 meters and 23 clicks up will be 1,300 meters and so on. So that is where the real skill level becomes important.
What Tony's referring to here are wheels on the scope that allow the sniper to adjust the range, physically clicking up and down to make it shorter or longer.
To simplify things, for example, on ATW, I had a ballistic range drum under the scope that was very accurately calibrated from 300 to 2,400 meters. So if you zeroed the scope correctly at the short range, you could dial it up very quickly and instantaneously and come back as well, without having to fiddle and be confused with all these odd numbers that scopes normally are with. So the skill level with a normal rifle like that, SnipeX, the Alligator, is the guy really has to understand what's going on with his scope, how it actually operates, for him to be able to accurately dial in the distance. But there's another guess factor as well, and that's called wind. which is a much bigger factor than most people think, because there's no adjustment on the scope that automatically allows you to dial the wind out. So that is dependent on his experience. He's got to be able to read the conditions, and you can imagine how difficult that is at extended ranges. And the wind is often blowing much harder out in the open than people think. You know, sometimes at a distance of 1,500 meters, it can blow a 14.5 projectile off by the length of a bus. So it gives you an idea of how good you have to be at being able to spot your shots and compensating very, very quickly for that. And there's another factor as well. It's called mirage. In high temperature conditions, mirage can also affect you. So unless a soldier or a sniper is properly trained to read those conditions, it becomes very difficult to actually hit something at long range.
Mirage is the shimmer that distorts the way hot objects appear, like a road in summer, which looks like there's water resting on it, when in fact there isn't. Since Barrett created the first AMR, almost every military in the world has built one. I wanted to know why.
It's quite a low-cost deterrent. For example, in a mountainous area where you might have some insurgents and so on, and you'll have bunkers to keep an eye out, an anti-materiel rifle could be quite useful in that you could fire across valleys and have some effect without firing expensive missiles. The costs of the whole system compared to these other things, you can't waste an expensive guided missile of some kind on a suspected something going on out at a long distance. So it has some usefulness. I was actually surprised at how many have been sold, you know, because I have a good experience with the unwieldiness of these things, and they're really heavy and awkward to move around. So again, I would imagine in certain cases where you've got a base protection of some sort, or mountain passes to protect or such like, they could be quite useful in that sort of scenario. You can't see them as a tactical mobile weapon in the same sense that an assault rifle is, or an ordinary sniper rifle.
What does Tony think of the Alligator rifle based on what he's seen?
I find it surprising that it weighs as much as it does. If you consider the Russian PTRD, I think it was the single-shot Second World War rifle, it looked very simple and like a piece of pipe, but it was a lot cleverer than people think. That weighed only 17 kilograms. It didn't have a scope, so obviously its range was limited. In the case of the Alligator, it's 25 kilograms. So I just wonder why it's as heavy as it is. I don't think they have a very efficient recoil system on it, from what I can see. One of the big problems with a rifle like that is eye relief on the scope. In other words, the distance of the scope from your eye becomes a bit of a problem because of the recoil. So either you've got to mitigate the recoil, or have a scope with a long enough eye relief. That means that the distance of the scope from your face, the further it can be, the more violent the recoil can become. So I think in the case of the Alligator, it's a normal scope, probably about a 3-inch, or what do we say, about 75 millimeter eye relief. So you need the weight of the scope of the gun to be able to control it properly, so it doesn't hurt you. And also, the heavier any rifle is, the less it recoils. It might have a bit of a recoil mitigation in the buttstock to reduce the recoil a little, and usually most of the recoil is taken out by a muzzle brake. That's probably the reason why it's 25 kilograms, and it can't be taken down, from what I can gather. The barrel can't be removed quickly. So a 25 kilogram item, you can imagine, is not such an easy thing. You can move it maybe 50 meters, but beyond that you're going to be done.
And how about the rifle's destructive power?
14.5 has, I think, over 30,000 joules of energy. A half-inch Browning, 50 Browning, has got about 16,000 joules. So you can see the amount of energy that a 14.5 has is really, really huge. It can penetrate 30 millimeters of RB 500 armor plate at 100 meters, quite easily. 30 millimeter armor is quite thick, believe me. So that shows you that the thing is really, really powerful. I think things like a BTR would be vulnerable, especially from the side. I think 14.5 will punch holes through it quite easily. And that class of earlier generation APCs would be very vulnerable to this. They can also inflict damage to the sensors on a vehicle. You know, it's not so easy to do that. But if you shoot at the frontal aspect of the vehicle, there's all sorts of vision blocks and thermal images and sighting systems that can be damaged with it.
And now the big question. Does Tony think there's a use for huge sniper rifles such as this one in modern warfare?
In an urban environment, you could dump shots through windows and certain key locations at longer range and so on. If you're deployed behind the troops which are moving forward, they can provide cover of some accurate cover that's maybe has less collateral damage. I've noticed in the countries that have been sold to, their requirements have been different, each one of them. You know, they bought them for different reasons. So it depends very much on each individual and what their problems are and how they try to solve them.
That's where this tape stops, but we'll be back to play you through another episode of War on Tape. Hey everyone, thanks for watching. If you want more videos like this in your feed, don't forget to hit like and subscribe to our YouTube channel.